On Saturday, July 30th, 1994, right around 1 a.m., a group of young people saw two mysterious lights out in the distance. At first, they thought maybe they were headlamps from people riding bicycles. But then, by the way they were moving, they thought maybe they were flying saucers. But once they got close enough, one of the witnesses could clearly see what they were. And then she blurted out, "They're little people." In 1639, a man named James Everall and two others saw a great fiery light in the sky as they were rowing a boat down the river.
When it stood still, it flamed up and was about 3 yards in diameter. When it moved, it contracted into the shape of a swine.
Over the next few hours, this strange light traveled back and forth from where these men were here in the river to the village of Charlton. Consequently, several people in the village saw this light as well. Well, this continued on for the next few hours, and when this mysterious light finally went away, the 3 men in the boat found themselves a full mile upstream, which seemed impossible as none of the men remembered rowing themselves there, and that of course would have been against the current. It was as if this light had something to do with this mysterious transportation. If reported today, this account would no doubt be classified as your typical UFO sighting, with the men having had been abducted and then their memories altered. But 5 years later, this phenomenon returned, and this time it looked like a man and brought voices.
About midnight, 3 men coming in a boat to Boston saw 2 lights rise up out of the water near the north side of town. The 2 lights were in form like a man. They traveled for a small distance and then disappeared. About a week later, 2 more lights appeared. They merged together and separated several times. And while this was happening, a voice was heard upon the water between Boston and Dorchester, calling out in the most dreadful manner, "Boy, boy, come away, come away!" And it would suddenly shift from one place to another a great distance. This happened about 20 times. It was heard by several God-fearing, honest people.
Now, that doesn't sound at all like a modern-day UFO abduction to me. As a matter of fact, all through history, there's been sightings of strange lights in the sky and encounters with otherworldly beings. But it wasn't until the summer of 1947, after Kenneth Arnold reported seeing strange objects flying past his plane at nearly 2,000 miles per hour, that the world seriously began to ponder the idea that these lights just might be connected with beings from other planets.
I believe it may be a visitor from another planet, more developed than ours. In my opinion, we're just beginning to see things this world never dreamed of.
In this video, we're going to consider the possibility that at least some of the strange alien encounters are not what humans have thought they were, and that there is something other than the traditional extraterrestrial visiting Earth, something that's plasma-based and other-dimensional, something that can phase in and out of our reality and seems more like magic than technology. And to do this, we'll be investigating the ideas of a man named Andrew Collin. He's been studying the UFO phenomenon for over 30 years, and he's come to a very different conclusion than the rest of the world. We'll share 3 separate accounts that seemingly support his ideas. The first one was reported in 1956 and is extremely brief. Then we'll look at a much more detailed account from 1994, where a group of young people encountered strange fiery orbs that seemed to be plasma-based and were able to stop time. And then finally, we'll look at a sighting that was reported by a sheriff's deputy just 10 years later. And then, to wrap it all together, we'll consider a few statements that Andrew Collin has made about his theories. Then stick with us for our Fact or Fiction segment. There, I'm going to take less than a minute and give you my thoughts on this whole idea. And then Amy is going to come on and she's going to share information from ancient times that seems to describe this very same phenomenon. Perhaps this has been going on longer than we thought. So this report begins about 75 years ago. It began just like your typical run-of-the-mill UFO sighting, one like thousands of others. It was the summer of 1956 in Vale, Argentina, and several people were on their way home from work, leisurely walking and talking when they spotted it. It was a luminous sphere floating above a set of railroad tracks right up ahead. Well, everybody stopped talking and rushed to get a closer look. It was about 6 feet in diameter, and it was hovering just above the ground. What made this experience different than, say, a typical UFO sighting was what the people saw inside. It was transparent, and the people could clearly see that there was a man sitting in the center of the sphere. He appeared to be wearing, now this is strange, a helmet, and he seemed to be working some unseen controls, as if he were directly piloting the sphere. Well, several people reported that they watched this object in utter amazement for a while, until it finally flew away. A little over 4,000 years ago, near what is now known today as Avery, United Kingdom, a group of people dug chalk and other materials out of the ground, and then they piled it all together into one big heap. Then, over the next few generations, more and more people dumped chalk and other materials onto this pile, and it got bigger and bigger. No one really knows why this was done, but today, this pile, known as Silbury Hill, stands almost 40 meters high. Because of its origins, it is mysterious. It's only a 40-minute drive from Stonehenge. Well, it was here in 1994 that our next story takes place. Paul Bagley was a young musician with a passion for the mysterious. Among other things, he enjoyed exploring crop circles and watching the night skies. On Saturday evening, July 30th, 1994, he took his girlfriend, Sonia Bailey, and a buddy of theirs named Rob out to Silbury Hill. The plan was for the three of them to climb to the top of Silbury Hill and watch the skies overnight, which was against the law. See, since 1974, Silbury Hill has been closed to visitors in order to protect its historical significance. Well, the drive from their home to the ancient mound was uneventful, but the climb, even though it was done under the cover of night, was filled with a bit of law-breaking, daring adrenaline. Once they got to the top, they noticed that there was a group of teenagers huddled together at the other end of the mound's flat surface. Well, they talked, laughed, enjoyed the night, watched the skies for a while, but then a strange fog began to roll in.
About 12:30, 1:45, this fog starts rolling in. It's really, really thick fog rolling across the ground. Not like normal fill-the-whole-sky fog. It hits the hill, and suddenly we couldn't see anything at all beyond the top of the hill.
As the three of them were contemplating this mysterious fog, they all heard a faint sound coming from somewhere down below. It sounded like someone was climbing up the side of the hill in the dark, just beyond the fog. So they all got quiet and listened, and that's when they saw the lights. Out in the distance, maybe a mile or so away, cutting through this thick fog, was what appeared to be a couple of very bright orange balls of fire.
It was either Rob or Sonia who said, "What's that?" and pointed out towards the direction of Long Barrow, and there were two orange lights that looked like fire, balls of fire, and they were bouncing.
As they were watching these bouncing balls of fire, they were suddenly overcome with a very potent odor of burning rubber, which Paul later said kind of smelt like sulfur or maybe smoke from a burning tire. These fiery points of light weren't just bouncing, they were moving, but at this point it was difficult to tell exactly what direction that they were headed. And as the trio was puzzling this, trying to imagine pathways and roads below, the bells of St. James's Church chimed in the distance, announcing that it was 1 a.m. And then, for some reason, all of the dogs in the neighboring farms began barking like crazy.
The bell chimed 1, and all the dogs started going ballistic, and there was a really odd smell. Right then, I heard a weird whispering. So I stood up and I went to the edge of the hill and looked over. I wasn't able to see very far into the fog, and I said to Rob and Paul, "There's something coming up the hill." And at that point, I got really scared, which isn't like me.
The two men shifted their attention into the direction that Sonia was pointing, but they couldn't see anything through that thick fog. When they looked back up, they saw that these fiery orbs were now heading in their general direction, seemingly following one of the many footpaths below. The lights were behaving oddly. Remember, they were bouncing up and down, so the group thought about it. Well, maybe they were orange bicycle lamps and they were mounted to the front of bicycles, which were riding over bumpy terrain. Yeah, that might be it. Well, the thought that they might be bicycle lamps reminded Sonia that she had a bicycle lamp in her bag, so she pulled it out and switched it on, hoping that they would get a better view. Unfortunately, all it did was bounce light off of the fog, making it impossible to see anything, so she switched it right back off. But that quick shining of the light might not have been the wisest thing to do, because the moment that she shut it off, the group could clearly see that whatever these fiery orange orbs were, they had now changed direction, and they were headed straight for the group. Eerily, at the precise moment that Sonia had flipped her bicycle light on and off, these two balls of fire stopped dead in their tracks and then headed straight for the group. As they got closer, the trio could see that there was something beneath these balls of fire. Etching themselves out of the darkness, positioned directly below these burning orbs, were what appeared to be two three-sided pyramids, like these. As these strange fireball-toting pyramids approached, the group could see that the walls of the pyramids were actually translucent, and there were intelligently moving figures inside. Well, the moment was surreal, and as these objects floated up the side of Silbury Hill, these figures inside these pyramids came into focus.
Oh my God, they're little people.
Sitting at the center of each of these pyramids was a small humanoid figure, between 4.5 to 5 foot tall. Both of these figures had their hands clasped together in their laps, as if they were in some strange state of calm meditation.
The orange lights, they completely dispersed the fog, so it was almost like tunnel vision, and we could see these floating crafts clearly, but if we looked anywhere else, all we could see was complete fog.
Every so often, a flow of electrical energy would roll down the sides of one of these pyramids, giving a plasma-like feeling to the structures.
And you could clearly see the outline of these beings within these objects. Whatever these beings were, we still don't know to this day, but they were sitting cross-legged, and they came straight up the hill towards us.
Once these objects were less than 20 feet away, reality changed. It took on this surreal quality. First, there was this growing electrical charge in the air, like static electricity. It eventually became so strong that everyone could hear the buzzing. Then everything slowed down, making it feel like it was all happening in slow motion. Sonia remembered that at one point she reached her hand out toward one of these globes, and as she did so, she found herself in two places at once. She could still see through her own eyes, but now she had a second vantage point. She was also looking from somewhere behind her, so she could clearly see the back of herself as she was reaching forward toward one of these structures beyond. In this time-slowed state, she began to hear this whispering. A moment later, she realized that the whispering was only happening in her head. Well, the whispering got louder and became a high-pitched crackling. The group contemplated later that maybe these beings were trying to communicate. Just then, Paul and Sonia looked over at that group of teenagers. At first, it appeared that maybe they were sleeping, but as they looked closer, they saw that their bodies were covered with some strange type of greasy black liner, which glistened in the fog light. But outside of this glistening, there was absolutely no movement at all, as if the youths were somehow frozen in time.
Everything was very weird. It's like everything stopped, like somebody turned off everything. Nothing moved. Everything was just like suspended.
Then suddenly, a pulse of energy, like a silent explosion, erupted from the top of one of these pyramids. And Paul and Sonia watched in slow motion as Rob was seemingly knocked backward by the percussion. When they turned back around, these strange structures were leaving. And as they went, the pyramid portions of them faded into the darkness, leaving only these fiery orbs in view. Once they reached the street, an odd thing happened. The fireballs merged together, becoming a single light source, and then the trio watched as something, or someone, stepped out of the orb.
They turned into one ball of light, and then two beings of light. I don't know what they actually were, but they had arms, legs, heads, hands. They came out of the light, and they were holding hands with one another.
Paul said that when these beings, whatever they were, came out of the light, to him, it felt like they were stepping through a hole in space. They never touched the ground. A minute later, they stepped back inside of the fireball and it continued traveling away from Silbury Hill. Shortly after this, the experience was over, and then the trio suddenly became aware of all of the ambient sounds around them. The wind, the dogs in the distance. This sudden audible change made it obvious that during this entire experience, all of the sounds of nature had stopped. The group reflected later that it must have been right around the time that fog rolled in is when all the sounds dropped off. Extremely surreal. Oh yeah, it was just then that the trio looked over. Those teenagers, well, they were up and moving around and seemingly unaware that anything had even happened. Although well documented, this account is admittedly from a group of ordinary citizens. But our next account? That comes from a couple of trained police officers. It had been a beautiful day on the lake, and evening was approaching. Off-duty sheriff's deputy, David Crow, his buddy, Stephen Wagner, also an off-duty officer, and a friend of theirs, who wished to remain anonymous, had just spent the day fishing. It was Sunday, April 18th, 2004, and as the men were bringing their boat back to the dock, they noticed a small blue light in the sky over the lake, about the size of a softball. Well, fascinated, they watched as this light traveled to the other side of the lake and then dropped down behind a silo on an old abandoned farm. The men were curious. They were police officers, after all. Perhaps that's a trait that goes with the job. So they made their way across the lake. By the time they reached the other side, it was twilight, and they could clearly see a faint blue glow shining out from behind the silo. They secured their boat and walked toward the glow. The closer they got, the brighter that glow seemed to become. As they rounded the corner of the silo, they saw something extraordinary.
The sphere was now about the size of a small, compact automobile. It was still vivid cobalt blue in color, but it was transparent, like a large soap bubble.
Inside this bubble was what appeared to be a normal human couple.
The man and the woman had their hands pressed together, and they appeared to be sharing a kind of joint meditative state. Their eyes were closed.
The three men stood dumbfounded.
The sphere itself appeared to have a watery or plasma-like consistency. It was clearly transparent, but just slightly wavy on its surface.
The experience was like something out of a dream, and Sheriff Crow was a smoker, so without thinking, he nervously pulled a cigarette out of his pocket and he lit it. And when he did, the flash from his lighter broke the couple's meditation, and then the woman turned her head and looked directly at the men. Oddly, even though they should have, none of them felt even the slightest bit of fear. It was as if some magical outside force was keeping them calm. Then, and I found this extremely strange, the woman smiled and waved, to which Sheriff Crow found himself unconsciously waving back.
The woman then did something quite remarkable. She reached down and pushed her hand through the barrier of the sphere, touched the grass, and picked up some of it. After contemplating the green shoots in her palm, she then turned and pressed her hands against the hands of her mate.
The men stood there in awe as this light moved up into the night sky and eventually just faded into the background and looked like any other star. So there you have it. Andrew Collins might say that these encounters and others like them prove that humanity isn't being abducted by space aliens, right? It might seem implausible, but after spending 32 years researching this phenomenon, Andrew Collins strongly believes that most, if not all, of what we think of as extraterrestrial alien encounters are really just conscious connections with higher or other dimensional beings that can transform themselves into whatever images that we might perceive them to be.
The most likely explanation for UFOs is that they are plasma-based beings that can transform themselves into a structured form that we interpret as alien spacecraft.
When he was asked directly whether or not he believes in the existence of space aliens, he said this.
Space aliens almost certainly do exist, but the evidence presented by UFO sightings, close encounters, and missing time episodes indicates this has nothing to do with flesh and blood aliens coming from out of space.
Okay, but what about all of the UFO crashes that we've all heard about?
There are indeed too many recorded to dismiss all of them, but there's no hard evidence that any UFO crash was actually an extraterrestrial vehicle.
Well, surely there's enough reported alien abductions to support the idea of space aliens.
Aliens like the Greys are a modern-day phenomena, popularized by films like Close Encounters of the Third Kind and books such as Communion by Whitley Strieber. In the human psyche, they do exist and will be encountered by individuals during episodes of missing time, but this is of our making. This is now what we as a race expect to happen during such episodes. In the past, the Greys were the fairies of folklore and the demons of Christian dogma. Some semblance of them has been carried over to our modern-day vision of their existence. So, in that respect, yes, aliens like the Greys do exist.
Okay, but what about the alien agenda and this interplanetary breeding that seems to be going on?
I do believe that light-based intelligences behind missing time episodes must have their own thoughts and agendas. However, I doubt whether those are universal agendas, since they are interacting with us in a manner that we want or expect them to. Some part of us wants harrowing medical examinations and evidence of sexual manipulation in order to create a hybrid race. Seemingly, we've wanted this ever since medieval times, when sinners were often thought to be dragged off to hell to undergo pain and torment at the hands of demons and devils.
All right, then, explain implants. That's definitely hard evidence of space aliens.
California's surgeon, Dr. Roger Lear, has removed a number of objects that people claim to be implants. But any suggestion that they possess extraterrestrial characteristics is pure speculation.
So, to recap, Collins believes that UFO close encounters are not at all what we thought they were. He says that they're actually interactions with higher dimensional reality, or bubble universes, as he calls them. He says that connecting with them causes us to see and interact with all kinds of horrible things like DNA-altering aliens that aren't really there. And it's more or less our consciousness that's creating a false reality, basically because that's in our nature, or we believe that somehow we deserve these things. And the few experiences that people have had over the years, like the ones in this report, where the mind is kept clear and open, shows that there's strong evidence to support his ideas.
If we just let go of our fears and embrace these experiences differently than we have in the past, they can transform us into better individuals, bringing out our creative genius. Such experiences almost certainly happened in the past, just as they do now. And to see them as exclusively the product of an alien agenda is to undermine their true value to humanity.
So, what do we make of Andrew Collins' crazy ideas? Are there really no such things as traditional space aliens? So many people all over the world have claimed to have had encounters with other planetary beings that it seems almost impossible to me to believe that all of them got it wrong. But then again, Collins does seem to be right about one thing. Overall, the human race sure does seem to be a bunch of negative-dwelling individuals who create the very nightmares they're trying to avoid. And it seems like that's just human nature, to get upset when the line isn't moving fast enough, or someone doesn't quite measure up to our expectation, having no time to give a little extra love to those a little bit less fortunate. Quick to bite, slow to comfort. Perhaps some of the alien encounters are what we've always thought that they were, and perhaps there are also higher dimensional beings of light and love that visit us from time to time as well. Amy found evidence that this phenomenon, believe it or not, has been going on for thousands of years. We're going to be stopping this at 50,000.
Oh, yeah.
We're at 46,000 by the time of this recording. 46, something like that. So what's going on?
So I looked into this idea of orbs or spheres as like a mode of travel. This goes back to ancient times, and they are called Merkabah Spheres. Now, if you do an internet search, one of the first things you'll find, it says, Merkabah Spheres are rooted in ancient Egyptian times.
Oh, wow.
And they say Mer means light, Ka, spirit, and Ba, body. So the translation is this vehicle of light to transport the body. But if you dig deeper and deeper into that, I can't find any primary source where they're like, here's this hieroglyphic.
Wow.
So there is an ancient Egyptian word, I believe it's Merket.
Okay.
And it is actually an instrument to measure time, which I thought, well, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
And they called it the instrument of knowing. Okay, so, maybe there is a link to this word Merkabah that goes back to ancient Egypt, right? Yeah. Okay, so where I really feel like I kind of hit pay dirt was in the book of Ezekiel. I think it's chapter 1, I think verses like 4 to 26. It talks about this chariot of God, I believe it says, and that it is driven by the likeness of man. But I thought, wait, the word Merkabah is never mentioned. Well, the word Merkabah comes from the Jewish translation. In Hebrew, Merkabah means chariot. So out of the book of Ezekiel comes this idea of Jewish mysticism, or they call it Merkabah mysticism. And one of the central themes is this Merkabah, or vehicle of light, to transport you to other dimensions through space and time. And I thought, wow, that is absolutely very fascinating, right? However, I did find some references kind of stating like only certain people should try to conjure this Merkabah sphere because it is very dangerous.
So it's not like a machine.
No.
This is like you meditate, and then you create your own bubble of.
Right.
Is it time travel? Is it just traveling in space?
It seems to be all of that. It's almost this bubble of this energy that allows you to transport yourself space, time, and it mentioned into other universes, right? So not even, just here.
So it's kind of like astral projection, right?
Yeah, but some sources say like people have learned, I guess, how to transport their physical selves. Which would make sense if that's what was going on in the story, where that woman reached down supposedly and
touched the grass,
picked something up. Yeah.
So do you think it's possible that somebody could get to the place of enlightenment where they could meditate themselves through space and time?
As I read more about it, I was absolutely fascinated. And I wondered, what if people have figured out how to do that, right? And what if these people that, Paul's story and the sheriff's story and the story from 1956, what if there was just something going on in their universe and in their openness to see something that they weren't afraid? Maybe it's possible. I mean, I've heard about people manifesting all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So why couldn't there be somebody so enlightened that they could manifest travel through space and time?
So what do you think about Andrew Collins's ideas, though, that we're not being visited at all by anything flesh and blood from another planet, but this is higher intelligences, bubble universes, and it's only us that are making, the nightmares.
Right.
What do you think about that?
I kind of dug into that as a possibility because the term flying saucer or whatever came out, and then all of a sudden everybody's using the term flying saucer. Right. And then someone came out with, I was, abducted by aliens and this is how they look. Right. And then everybody explains them in the same way.
Yeah.
Okay. Now the argument can be made. They've all remained the same because they have the same
that's
experience.
Who they are. Exactly. People see gray aliens because there's gray aliens.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
All right. Well, thanks again.
You're welcome.
You may not know this, well, then again, you might. Reports like these are my favorite type of reports. I love anything that has to do with time travel or other dimensions. Like the account of Wroxham Road, people have claimed to have encountered a peculiar old hermit while enjoying the waters in Wroxham Road, England. Strangely, during these encounters, this hermit introduces one of the emperors of Rome, and just when the visitor thinks that this man is crazy, the landscape transforms, and suddenly it's as if the visitor has been transported all the way back to a time when that part of England was under the control of the Roman Empire. It's interesting because there's a ton of evidence that these encounters have been happening for centuries, and one would think that this old hermit would speak Latin, but strangely, he always speaks whatever language that the visitors do, and that's odd. We did a report on this. We included it in a larger report where we share other little-known time slip stories as well. If you're into that sort of thing and you'd like to see it, it's here.
Hey guys, if you've watched this far, then you're definitely a fan. And if that's the case, check out our merchandise on Fourth Wall. We got some pretty cool stuff there, and maybe you might just get roped in.
Oh.
It's cheesy.
Yeah, that is. Mozzarella.